Welcome to the CURE-PDX podcast, where we share insights, methods, and strategies for a less polarized, less violent, and more humane world. I'm your host, Ryan Akade. Today, I'm joined by two guests. We have James Patton, the president and CEO at the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, or ICRD, and Gabriel Flores, a pastor and spiritual director, and also a colleague of mine at Cure Violence Global. The three of us discuss the mission and work of ICRD, the importance of understanding the complexity of identity, differences between international and domestic contexts, the relationship between ideology and faith, how we relate to and wield our beliefs, the importance of humility, and many other topics. Hope you enjoy the show. Okay, I am here with Gabe and James Patton. Guys, thanks so much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Great. So, James, you are with an organization called ICRD that the CURE-PDX project has fortunately got a lot of time to work with, at least in the last few weeks. So just to start, tell us, what is ICRD? What do you guys do?
Well, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy is what that stands for. Kind of rolls off the tongue a little better as an acronym. But ICRD has been around now for over 25 years. It was actually founded by a former military officer by the name of Dr. Douglas Johnston, who wrote a book, I believe it was 1994, called Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft, when he was at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington. And his argument there was, in the world of realpolitik, we do ourselves a huge disservice not recognizing that faith has an extraordinarily important place in people's decision-making writ large, but also about how we relate between different communities at the community level itself, but all the way up to geopolitical level. And he was kind of one of just a couple of voices in the wilderness at the time, saying we really need to figure out how to do this and how to do it well. I think in the post 9/11 period, maybe that message became more resonant with people, but perhaps not in the best way, right? It was kind of, okay, religion is part of the problem, and we need to find a way to de-religify spaces or people or policies, particular religions, especially, right? Particular ideologies that were seen through a securitized lens more than anything. So ICRD was founded prior to 9/11 because Doug had wanted to put boots on the ground. He wanted to put together interreligious teams, people from different faith traditions that could go into places where faith identity was either part of a dynamic that was potentially leading to conflict or had led to conflict, or was an underutilized asset within these communities that were trying to avoid or recover from violence. So he established ICRD. It was very small at first, and then really kind of took off before I joined. It started to engage in some bigger programs that were extended for years and years. For example, when it was first started, we did some work in Sudan to help move along the comprehensive peace agreement between the South and the North with an interreligious committee that we set up there. We did some work in Kashmir and Afghanistan. But when I joined in 2011, we had started work in Pakistani madrasas, working with madrasa teachers to really re-establish the sense of pedagogy in these spaces around multidisciplinary thinking, around ideas of tolerance and inclusion, things that had been kind of excluded over time that were part of the heritage of the madrasa system from its inception, when it was, during the golden age of Islam, when it was really kind of a model for what we now do in higher education in the West. And so the reason I use that example is because we really, that's a great way of describing how we do it. We try to work at the culture and the faith of the space with which we are working. Now, that program obviously was designed around what has since been called the Preventing Violent Extremism lens, with the idea being that youth who are being trained just on rote memorization of their sacred texts, which they are in a language they don't actually even speak. There are very few Pakistani youth that speak Arabic, and then having it interpreted for them by others was really limiting their sense of, what the richness and what the availability of pro-social values were within those sacred texts. And so they were highly susceptible to recruitment by extremist organizations. So we came in working within the context of the faith, led by a Pakistani-born Muslim, the program, because that's the kind of way that we try to engage what we do. So again, established to try to work on faith in conflict dynamic spaces, not because religion is necessarily a driver, but because, as Pew Charitable Trust said in one of their studies some years back, 84% of the global population self-describes as religious. And I think that a lot of times we try to think our way around or work our way around religion in these kinds of community-based programs or policy programs, but it's there anyway. And so if we don't take it seriously and if we don't understand it, someone is going to use it to their advantage, and sometimes their goals are not necessarily all that positive. And so we have 4 core objectives that I like to talk about. One is, undeniably, faith has been used to drive identity-based conflict and violence. And so one of our core objectives is to remove religion as a driver of violence. And I'll give an example of one of the programs that we did for about a decade. We worked with the Ministry of Education in Saudi Arabia on their textbooks. And we did this quietly behind the scenes and did not make it a big public program, primarily because there was a lot of sensitivity at the policy level with the Saudis around this. But they did want to understand why the West saw these texts as promoting intolerance. And so we worked with them on removing elements of anti-Semitism, anti-Shiism, a lot of the language or interpretations of the sacred text that then kind of pushed this idea that those who were not of a particular strain of Sunni Islam were not okay and maybe could be dealt with intolerance and even violence. And so for a decade, we worked with them, and they really made huge strides in transforming those books. And some reports have come out recently through other organizations that have identified those strides that they have made, including a report that we did make public a few years ago. But the other 3 objectives are really about the kind of what I would call an asset-based approach to faith identity in places of potential or active violence. And the first one is to build the capacity of religious peace builders. So there are religious actors out there who find within their tradition the motives to try to get people to turn to alternatives to violence as a response to conflicts and crises. And one example I can give of that is we worked in Colombia with women of faith, Christian and indigenous and Afro-traditionalists, who had been working on kind of an interfaith conflicts framework for a while. And we worked with them around reconciliation concepts and trainings to help reintegrate former combatants who were getting out of the FARC or the ELN or the paramilitaries as they were working their way up to and through the peace process between the government and the FARC. And so they were working at the community level to try to get people to understand how their faith inclined them towards and what were some of the methodologies that could be employed in reconciliation processes to help reintegrate these former combatants who were stigmatized. Another of the objectives is to create more religious peace builders, right? So it's pretty logical in that sense. And we worked for a long time in Yemen, actually prior to and then during the current violence that's there, identifying where tribal and faith leaders might play a bigger role in supporting community decision-making that would avoid identity-based conflict between the tribes and between communities where government really was somewhat absent. And in many cases, it was actually the extremist groups, Al-Qaeda or ISIS, who were offering some of these services, whether they were mediation services or whether they were social services where the government was absent. And we worked to help these faith leaders realize their capacity to do some of these things and thereby also isolate these very violent groups that are based on a violent interpretation of ideology. And there were comments from one of the programs I remember we did was to help install water, because one of the communities had a water program and the ones around them did not. So they involved the youth that were being recruited in this program. And at the end, I remember one of the young persons said, you know, we used to think the government had to do this stuff. And when they were no longer around, we turned to these outside groups. But now we realize we can do it ourselves. And so we don't want anything to do with these extremists anymore. And in fact, that group of youth from that program then went around, raised funds themselves to train communities, surrounding communities, to expand that project so that the impact was even greater than what we had initially envisioned. And then the last objective really is to try to tie in religious peace building with other kinds of peace building. A lot of times we silo out this kind of religious identity piece and religious action piece as though it's, you know, only for the religious or only for a religious problem, when it can actually be very effective when it's married with other kinds of actions. So I think of some of the research that we did to inform policy in North Africa on engaging conservative faith leaders as peace builders, where they were seen a certain way from the outside because of their religious identity. These were Salafi actors in particular, but many of them were Salafi actors who explicitly rejected the use of violence to advance their religious identity or their policy goals. And so they were, not only were they great partners in that sense, but they also have the authenticity and the legitimacy in the face of or in front of the communities of youth who are sometimes being recruited into groups like ISIS. And so they can actually transform those attitudes in these target communities where, you know, a guy like me, an Irish Italian ex-Catholic Quaker from Boston, is not going to stumble into a garage mosque in the outskirts of Tunis and tell these kids, hey, you really shouldn't ought to be getting involved in this stuff. But these folks can. And so if we leave them out of the equation, then we are operating with one hand, kind of proverbially tied behind our back, so to speak. So we've done this work across the world. We've been active for 25 years now. We are not ourselves a religious organization, so we don't adhere to any particular faith doctrine, but we were founded by and are populated by religious people of all stripes and people with no faith, both as the practitioners on the team and the board members and supporters, because really it's not a matter of advancing one ideology. It's a matter of finding and elevating the best of our different traditions that religious adherents believe should be brought to bear to help solve common problems. And in this case, the problem of identity conflict and violence. And one last note, you know, we took that conservative religious actor engagement model and pivoted a couple of years ago to a domestic program, which was really our first significant domestic program. And as you know, having been connected to it, it is now a very important part of our portfolio. And I think that the needs are incredibly evident here. And in fact, in just the last few years, have probably gotten dramatically more evident, because the polarization and the division in the United States is getting very scary. You know, it's to the point where people are operating with entirely different ideas of what's going on, and the ability to have them share a conversation in that space is greatly reduced. And one of the things that we have found is that there are a lot of conservative religious actors in particular who are having a hard time using their faith, their text, their sacred documents, even the spiritual core of their faith, to get people to hear one another. And in fact, some of them are getting thrown out of their jobs when they're trying to do this. And it's not just that we're aiming at conservatives over progressives or liberals or however you want to call it. It's just that where the faith element manifests more strongly around potential conflict, and where that's an asset to try to make change right now, we're locating that work in conservative communities. But our goal in the end, obviously, is what it always is to build understanding and bridges of dialogue and collaboration, inshallah, between different identity groups. So that's a pretty wide-ranging response to your question, but that's roughly who we are and what we do. And again, we've been in over 25 countries across the world, from Myanmar through Saudi Arabia and Yemen into the Sahel, North Africa, into Latin America, now here at home.
Thank you. That was an amazing overview. Super articulate, super smooth. Really cool to hear about all the work that ICRD has done around the world. It sounds to me very similar to Cure Violence Global, just with specifically a faith angle, but I think a lot of the methods and success stories and types of work is very, very similar. I have another question I want to ask you, because you had mentioned that there's been a lot of international work, and that you've recently pivoted to doing more domestic work, doing the same type of work around violence prevention and addressing the climate of political polarization, particularly as it manifests in conservative-leaning faith communities. What are the biggest differences working overseas versus working at home here in the U.S.? Like, are there certain aspects of the polarized and extremist political landscape in the US that's like more difficult than working in, say, Pakistan or all the other countries you mentioned?
In some ways, absolutely not, and in some ways, yes. And I think the absolutely not part of it is human conflict. While it is very complicated to unpack, and it's complicated to redirect, if it's really gathering steam and people are really engaged in what I'm calling the kind of essentialist and existentialist cycle, where we reduce our own identities down to singularity, and we reduce the identity of the other down to a singularity. And if you're that, then you're a whole bunch of other things. And if I'm this, then I'm a whole bunch of other things. And there's no space for nuance. And then the existential part is, now your identity and my identity are incompatible. They can't exist at the same time. And in fact, you are dangerous to my very existence. Now there's only really one outlet, which is to eliminate the other, right? That kind of extreme polarization of thinking and identifying self and other, and fear and conflict around that is not uncommon in the human experience. And there are plenty of examples of it throughout history. Now, every context, of course, is going to be radically different, even from individual to individual, much less community to community. And that means that you have to take an approach that allows you to receive principally from the people that you want to engage with, because you need to understand how they feel and see things. That's so much, and what assets they bring to bear, and what are the real things that are behind their fear or anger that might be part of the solution to this. I mean, we work a lot with religion, and so ideology is a big part of it. But in many, many cases, that ideology is being used by certain conflict entrepreneurs to wrap around some more basic fears or concerns of individuals or communities, to mobilize them to act. And if you can get at some of those underlying issues, you can oftentimes de-escalate and reorient the conversation away from this ideological polarization. It doesn't mean to move someone out of their faith belief or their convictions. It just means to start to address some of the core concerns that underlie that. Because most people, honestly, very, very few people, although they do exist, are really ideologically driven to hurt others. Most of the time, they need something, or they're afraid of something, and that fear and that need can be intertwined. And a lot of times, it's kind of basic needs. It's, am I going to have a job? Are my kids going to have food? The things I believe in, is there room for that in this society? Do I have an outlet to express myself and to be who I want to be? And those things then are similar from space to space in the theoretical. But when it comes to the actual practical lived experience of it, it's going to be very, very different. And so our methods really are really initially based on hearing others and getting others to hear one another. And then there are some core methodologies that happen within that. How do you get someone to be open to hearing somebody? Well, there's lots of experience and practice on getting connected to someone's story, working with them to see that they do maybe have this other need, that maybe they shouldn't be attaching one part of the identity to the other part of the identity. And once you start working through some of those things, then you can build an openness for people to connect and reconnect, honestly, across some of the things that they do share, even though they see themselves as being very, very different. So it's a real mix between some kind of standard human experience and very unique expressions of that experience. And I think right now, and particularly in the United States, one of the things that has changed things so dramatically is mis and disinformation using virtual platforms, you know, so social media and non-traditional media has really changed the game, because it's about how someone is engaged in defining who they are. Who do they trust? What language are they hearing? What messages are they hearing? And it's very, very different if you're in a, you know, a little mud church in South Sudan, or in a, you know, a temple in Cambodia, than it is when people are behind a screen somewhere in the United States, and both virtually and physically moving away from each other. So they're not exposed to the diversity of identity of the quote unquote other. So they can have this idea of, you know, the other person being reduced to just a set of dangerous beliefs, right? There's a funny story about that I'll share. You can cut it out if you wish. And I'm borrowing this from a pastor friend of mine, but he talks about this Muslim friend of his who went to a Philadelphia Eagles football game. And when it came to for prayer time, he kind of snuck into the, you know, the cement corridor where they sell beer and stuff. And he was doing his prayer, and he felt this presence behind him. And as he's rolling up his prayer rug, when he finished and turns around, there's this big American guy behind him with this big football shirt on and his trucker hat and 8 beers in his hands. And he stares at him through his big beard, and he says, "You a Muslim?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir, I am." He said, "I don't like Muslims from everything I've heard about them. But you're an Eagles fan, so you can't be all that bad." And then he walks off, right? But that really captures the essence of how identifying the multiplicity of people's identities is a pathway to understanding and empathy, and maybe even collaboration, that then can turn you away from these polarized singularities of who people are. So yeah, I mean, the Eagles fan thing wouldn't happen outside the United States. So right, context does matter. And then the other thing on it, honestly, and maybe this is just a bit, you know, it's revealed a bit about myself, is I've worked now my whole life in international affairs. Most of my adult life, I lived outside of this country. But I think we believed a certain thing about this country that is now proving to be less true, which is, yeah, we fight and debate and don't agree and don't like each other, but the society is built around, and the institutions are built around this idea of throwing all that disagreement into a space, letting it haggle and hash things out, and getting an imperfect response. And if you don't like it, then you throw those people out, you try new people in a couple of years, and that's how we sort of migrate forward together as a community that values difference, even if sometimes it's hard to swallow, right? Because if I want to be who I am and I want to be protected in that, I sure as heck better allow you to be who you are and have you be protected in that, right? So your difference from me is actually important to me, because it allows for my difference from others, right? Obviously with some limits, you know, there are laws about what you can and can't do based on those identity differences. But that whole thing was sacred in a way, at least in our myth of who we were, in a way that I think we're watching get really, really challenged and is deeply threatened right now. And so that, I think I've woken up a little bit from the collective dream that we were maybe impervious to some of the things that we've seen elsewhere, and that this was work that we are helping other human beings do in other places. And I think it's a really important awakening. And obviously, you know, I'm not being naive. I know that the history of the United States is littered with identity violence and persecution and exclusion and hatred. But maybe we were just getting a little complacent, that things were moving in the right direction, that people were willing to hear what we had to say about having a voice in the way government runs, about accepting people who are different than you are, about protecting people's rights because they are innate, regardless of superficial characteristics. And I think we were kind of coasting along thinking, hey, the world is moving in this direction. This is great. And now all of a sudden we're turning around and saying, wow, this stuff can break. It can break if it's not really carefully protected. And I think, maybe those of us in the policy world were a little naive about how delicate it was here at home. So yeah, in that sense, just a little bit of personal, honesty and revelation about my own susceptibility to think there is an American exceptionalism. Well, guess what? Maybe there ain't, and we got to work harder at helping each other protect it, so that we're all safer and our kids are safer in a place where they can be who they want to work to be, and that's what we keep claiming is our society. So
yeah, James, I appreciate that so much. From personal anecdote to just general experience, like that's why we wanted to talk to you, is just to kind of get that out there, how you've experienced, from third world to international capacities in different contexts, and even now moving back to the US and doing, what sounds like to me is providing. I had someone once tell me that all of our emotional pain is looking for a relational home. And it's a general sort of overview of what we're all at a deeper level sort of hoping to find and to cultivate. And how do you do that when a country that continues to polarize and get further apart? And I think like no one set out to establish like tribes. And, there's that political term called tribalism, where people they're not congregating based on what they necessarily agree on, but rather who they hate and who they disagree with, and then carrying out those belief systems through behavior, which has led to, loss of life in the worst case, but on a more personal scale, it's, couples divorcing, it's moms and daughters losing relationship, 40-year friendships coming to an end. And one of the things that I wanted to come back to that you had mentioned was the group you had spent over 10 years with that eventually continued to carry on the work, even when you chose to, for whatever reason, remove your presence. And I think it speaks to like this, I guess, just to make things very simplified, and I'm just going to name that, it's very simple and just for the sake of context, but it's like useful models aren't meant to be perfect, but they are meant to be helpful. And we're all sort of walking on a journey, and and in so many different facets, whether it be our own personal trauma, our own story within relationships and friendship and professional, like career stuff, like all capacities, this could be completely applied across the board. But it's where we're in stages, each of us in different categories within our own life of a discovery, of healing and dealing, and then of helping. And it sort of sounds like your organization showed up to like, in the most gentle way. You saw the issue. It seemed like you identified, or your organization, based on whatever metrics led you there, you identified the issue. And you weren't afraid to build the relationship that required, because even if you are after someone's ideological like belief systems and how archaic they can be and how they're resulting in violence or resulting in the dismantling of another being, another person, you have to establish that relational equity in order to speak to that a lot of the time. And what I hear is like your team spent that 10 years to establish the equity, and then they almost like, what sounds like by your sharing, invited you into sort of changing some of the bylaws, sort of changing some of the language that has really carried a group for however long. And I just think if the US or if the globe at large, and the work we're doing with CBG is the same idea, it's less about approaching your ideological belief systems and much more about intercepting de-escalating all things violence, all things more polarization throughout the country. And so I guess the question, all of that was the context for the question I want to ask. And I know you can respect that, and I know you understand that. But I just wonder, like, how, because I loved Ryan's question around how the two sort of correlate. Is there overlapping spaces between an international context and a domestic case? And it sort of sounds like you're in that sort of, I'm sort of learning this in real time, and there's been this like reckoning happening for a lot of us, and that the way we thought it was is actually not penciling out. And so it's back to the drawing board in some ways and reassessing all things. And I wonder what it could look like to invite others into that space, and in a variety of contexts, like from all, and how long, how long, oh Lord, shall we wait, if you would, if there's even a timeline that's fair to apply to any of this, is I guess riff on that a little, if you would.
Well, yeah, and honestly, I always caution people in this work that this is not a linear process. There is no brokenness and unbrokenness, right? There are degrees and sometimes shifting shapes of healing and harm. It's interesting. I just was reading an article today about a NASA spacecraft that just flew through a solar flare, and now, I'll probably be corrected by the scientists on my use of the terminology, but it not only did they build this thing, they built it to withstand the expulsion of material from the surface of the sun, and it's sending back imagery and survives this, right? The things we can do technologically are astounding. And yet every single generation, we have to reteach ourselves and our kids and our communities not to collapse back into fear and anger when you have difference, and use violence as a means of overcoming that difference, or oppression or exclusion. That it's actually better for us if everyone is trying to be as understood and equally involved as possible. It will elevate the entire community, right? But that has to be retaught all the time, and not just generation to generation, to communities that have learned it already and have fallen back into that, to individuals who have come in and out of it, as you were saying. I mean, it's just, we're all in this cycle all the time. And so in a way that's liberating, right? Because it's like, oh, okay, I didn't have to solve this whole thing. But in a way, it's also exhausting, because you're like, well, I thought we already went through this, right? But that's just how it is, right? And so you've got to be married to the conviction that I can influence a space. Sometimes it's a space I want to influence. Sometimes it's a space I've been invited in to try to influence because of my experience or my past or my relationships. And I have an agenda in that space. You have to be honest with yourselves. People, a lot of times in this work, folks say, well, you got to go in without an agenda. No, I have a clear agenda. I want people to stop killing each other, right? Like, that's what our agenda as an organization is. Now, that could mean a whole bunch of different things. It can mean immediate stuff or sustainable stuff. It could mean collaborative work. It could mean separating people. It could mean isolating folks who are not willing to agree on that. So it all depends, right? But if your agenda is to get people to stop killing each other, and then work on the things around that, so maybe they don't want to kill each other anymore, and maybe actually the people around them get together to help make that happen and carry it forward. You've got all these different methods on how to do that. Most of it's really grounded in human empathy. Then yeah, I mean, the gist of your question is sort of, can other people be invited? Everyone needs to be invited into this, right? I mean, like, literally, it's one of these things, like, you got to tip the scale just by a virtue of the number of folks who don't know what they're doing or how to do it, but are committed to trying. because they believe in the principle. And honestly, that's what it is. It's really just a pretty straightforward principle, which is we're all better off if we don't collapse into violence. Our resources are better off. We use them for other things. You look at Costa Rica, got rid of their military in the 50s. One of the greatest, school and infrastructure examples in Latin America. Everybody else has been spending money on bombs and bullets, right? So that's one thing. Recovery and pain and the generational cycles of suffering can all be reduced if we all get into this. And honestly, we have to also be humble in the face of it and recognize we all have it within us to do horrible things, and we all have it within us to do extraordinary things. And the Quaker tradition that I ascribe to, there's a saying, find the light of the divine in the other, right? And in some cases it's pretty hard to do that when people are doing pretty grotesque things. But if you are convinced that we are fallible, we don't know all the answers, it starts with figuring out what might be positive in this space, and then driving towards that and lifting it up, elevating it in every way that you can. Then you've got mass networks of resources, human and otherwise, to bring to bear there, whether it's someone who has trust in that space, whether it's someone that's gone through the same transition. When I worked with gangs in Latin America, again, they'd look at me and they'd be like, yeah, okay, whatever. But when I brought in the 18-year-old kid from who had gotten out of prison recently, who had been in a gang, who had renounced that life, and he's got a scar and the tattoos, and he's telling these kids at 10 and 12 years old what they're heading into, he has their attention because he has legitimacy in their eyes, right? So it's about who is the messenger as well. You've got to find the right people to bring those messages forward, and you've got to be patient with this cycle of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back. A lot of things come out when people start to deal with their anger and their pain that make them kind of retrench a little bit, and that's okay. And you've got to go back in and rework that. I remember I was doing an engagement with victims and perpetrators of violence at one point, and I made a mistake and brought them together when they weren't ready yet to be in the same. And it deteriorated pretty quickly into justifications and recriminations, and it was really getting ugly. And so we stopped the session. And this is an interesting story because this goes to also how religion is important. In this case, it was Christian women, and the women victims of violence actually we were in a convent in Colombia and doing this reconciliation session. They went into the rooms and where we were staying and took bed sheets off and came out, and they enacted a passage from the Bible about the adulteress who's dragged through the dirt and thrown at the feet of Jesus, right? And if you know the story, it sounds like you're a pastor, so I'm sure you know the story. and the Pharisees and Sadducees and everybody around him all the authorities are yelling at him to command her to be stoned to death. And he famously says, let one amongst you who has not sinned cast the first stone. And my paraphrasing is probably pretty bad. But less famously, he finishes by saying to her, go now and don't sin again. And so they enacted this whole thing out and then sat down together with indigenous women that didn't have a biblical tradition. And this was really fascinating because it really resonated with the indigenous women, and they really connected on a spiritual level over this. But they said, if we are in the place of Jesus, for them, their spiritual leader, their God, how do we behave based on what he is showing us here? How do we be good disciples in the face of these former combatants who are clearly not repentant, who are here justifying what they've done? And they worked out elements of the reconciliation practice, which was listening, not reacting with anger or violence, but also demanding transformation on the other side as part of the negotiated engagement around this relationship. Don't sin again. So we brought it all back to a conversation around non-repetition with former combatants. How do we know this is what we're afraid of? Is this will happen again? You said you were sorry you killed my brother, and then 10 years later you killed my sister. Well, and you said I forgave you for the brother. Well, I can't do that if you're going to do the same thing over again. It's an evolving process of relationship building, trust building, healing that will never end. But their sacred text allowed them into that. My mistake allowed that to happen, which at the time I was concerned about, obviously. And it's one of these things where, to the other part of your question, there isn't a timeline because there isn't a line, if that makes sense. It's non-linear. This is relational. There's ebbs and flows. There are things that come in and come out that change things. Sometimes the people that you are angry at have died or been killed. Sometimes the people you want to ask for forgiveness from are no longer there. How do you do that, right? So all of this stuff is so deeply challenging, but the first step is to get people to say, all right, I'm going to lay down my weapon, at least for now, right? And look for a different way forward that doesn't include eliminating the other. And that's so critical. And again, it's so challenging because it's not always the same method. It's not always the same person. It's not always the same context in which you're operating, and you got to be very, very cautious so you don't actually, make things worse. And it's not an easy task for anybody who's trying to engage in it. But if you adhere to that core conviction that we are better if we don't do this to each other, it might hurt, it might be messy, I might be angry, but we did a film some years ago called Back from the Brink about violent extremism. One of the cases was Lebanon, and it's haunting to me to remember one of the interviews in that case study where the gentleman who was speaking said, "We don't remember how we got here." This was the civil war in Lebanon, a couple decades back. And he said, "We were fine. We were going along. We were all getting along. We were living together. We were marrying each other. We were in the markets together. And the next day, we're murdering each other in the streets. And we don't remember how that happened." And that's the kind of thing that scares me about where we are now in the United States. Is it we just keep ramping it up? We just push a little harder, push a little harder, push a little harder. We'll say something more for our own political gain or to raise money or, because we're not being heard. And what scares me is on the back end of this, if you do embrace that decline into violence, everything changes, and it just is so much harder to undo. So again, I think if we can just get people to commit to that not being an option, then you got a really sloppy, difficult, and hard to understand path away from your conflict, but you're not going to kill each other. That makes things exponentially worse.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I have another question. I want to bring it back a little bit to something you alluded to earlier, James, about the relationship or unhealthy relationship between ideology and faith. And Gabe, I'd like to actually get your perspective weighing in on this too. So one of the things that Ray and I have talked a lot about is this question in the Christian context, what Ray's been calling the theology of public engagement, right? And specifically, what is the right relationship to politics that Christians should have, right? And are there any kind of theological or biblical precedent for outlining the right relationship to politics or the degree to which faith and theological concerns can become intertwined with political and ideological issues, right? And so obviously now there's a big question on like Christian nationalism and the relationship between church and state, and was America a Christian nation? And these are some of the debates that are being had in certain circles, right? As Christians, how much should we care about our faith versus how much should we be advocating for some kind of political issue? Like obviously abortion is a big question in a lot of, kind of evangelical sectors in the US. So I'm curious for you, do you think that, and you can reject this binary frame if you don't agree, right? But I'm going to frame it like this to be a little provocative. Do you think a potential solution to just general de-escalation, depolarization, and taking the temperature down is to gently push back on ideological influences encroaching on faith? I think you would even use the word like ideological conflict entrepreneurs, kind of using ideological narratives to kind of wrap itself around faith and faith communities to push some kind of political agenda, perhaps even nefariously. So do you think that should be pushed back against, and there should be kind of a separation of the ideological frame and the theological frame? Or do you think the cat's out of the bag, so to speak? The two have gotten mixed together. This is where we are in America with the culture wars, and we have to find a way to just to live with that and find resilience and better dialogue amidst having a kind of a union between ideology, politics, and religion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you asked the easy questions, right? Get me on the record. The most important initial response would be to say that the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy does not want to take anybody's faith away. If anything, we are trying to advocate for people having strong convictions in the best of what their faith has to offer to the whole community. Whatever the faith might be that they embrace or don't embrace, what are the aspects of that that are healing over harmful, right? And collectively so. And one of those is to be able to believe in your religious convictions and have your religious identity. That's a big part of who we are, particularly in the United States, right? Is this idea that we are a pluralist community, which means your faith or other identity markers are protected. Where the problem comes is when your religious conviction excludes that freedom for others. When you have an ideology that is so fundamentalist that part of that is to say the existence of people who disagree with me is incompatible with my being who I want to be religiously, right? So your religious identity is based on eliminating people who disagree with that. That's a problem. And for me, theologically, because I can talk about that from the perspective of the divine, and does the divine wish for us to be out there harming others? And some would say, well, God thinks there are bad people and we should kill bad people. And I just don't understand why that God that they espouse needs human help killing people. That's a whole different conversation, right? It's a theological debate, and I'm willing and happy to have it. But more importantly, we live in a rule-based, law-based society. That is what the United States is, right? Rule of law, those laws determined by the society over time and through our court systems, adapted and changed through our representatives and legislators. They shift with time. Sometimes they're not great and we try to fix them. Sometimes maybe they were good and we broke them, but that's the process. And that's what it means to be American, right? To be a citizen of this country is to be committed to that being the way government and society happen. Now, if you don't like that and you want to break it, there are a couple different ways to go about it. One of them is to overthrow that system somehow. I personally think that human history is overwhelmingly defined by one person or group getting power and telling everybody else what they got to do. That's human history for the most part. Ruled by the people, with the messy diversity that implies and the uncertainty that suggests, and the need to accept things that you don't like, is very rare in human history. And if we break it, we will go back to, and we've seen some evidence of this in recent years, one side or the other getting control of everything and forcing everybody else to bend to their will. And we know what that looks like, right? That's authoritarianism in its different flavors, right? And that's just not, quote unquote, our way of life, right? That's not the American experiment, in my opinion. And I've lived in countries like that, lots of them. And, it's just one of the things I love about being American is that that's our reality. We don't have that, sic semper tyrannis. I know that's being used in interesting ways these days as a slogan, but thus always to tyrants was really what the idea was when we formed this space, which is ain't no one person going to force us to be what they want us to be. We get to define that as long as we stay within the parameters of the law, right? And then we get to shape the law. So that's actually, in my mind, really troublesome, because it's not happening on the right or the left. It's happening everywhere, right? We'll go back to Gabe used the term tribalism. You know, everyone's kind of retreating back into their group and saying, it's our way or the highway. And that's not going to work, at least not in a way that sustains a pluralist democracy, right? So one of those things has to change. And I think one of the things that we're not talking enough about, we talk about interfaith dialogue and interfaith conflict. We're not really talking as much about the intrafaith challenges right now. You know, you've got pastors who cannot go to the Christian religious texts right now to encourage people to not use violence. You know, if they get up and say the Beatitudes didn't include, you know, dehumanizing violence as one of the blessed sentiments that are being expressed by Jesus, you know, in the Sermon on the Mount, they're getting thrown out of their churches. They're losing their jobs, because the prophetic voice that encourages spiritual growth and spiritual engagement with the other is getting eclipsed by this absolutism that is wholly exclusive, and that's incompatible with a pluralist democracy. So I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to find those voices in those traditions who are conservative, who are religious, but who are willing to say, you know, our faith actually gives us a way to be all of these things at once and live in community. Can we not like things and be upset about them and try to change laws? Yeah, that's the way it works. Can we criticize others? Yeah, that's okay. But do we have the right, based on our theology, to say, you all cannot belong anymore, and we're going to destroy you if you do, or exclude you if you do? No, you cannot do that. That is not part of what the United States is about. There are other places like that, places that we claim to not like that much, who have, you know, religious authoritarian leaders, and it is a religious authoritarian state. Some in the news these days very prominently. And we claim that that's terrible, but it's because it's not our religion. So if it's ours, it's okay, right? And that's where we're running into problems. And I think you know, I did this thing out at Brigham Young a couple months ago, and the theme of, I guess it was the last one I did a year and a half ago. The theme was, you know, what do you do when religious law refuses to be subject to civil law? You know, when someone's ideology says, I can break the law because God told me I can. Because obviously for religious believers, it is natural that religious law is the most important thing. But for a citizen, it's the civil law that's the most important thing. And those religious identities and religious laws have got to be subject to the civil law if you consider yourself a citizen, right? And so that's a real paradox. It's a real challenge, because, again, as ICRD, we're not going to go tell someone their faith is not okay. We don't believe in that. We actually are proponents of well-lived spirituality as part of who we are as a community. And again, spirituality, I say, that includes religion, but non-religious virtues and values and belief systems as well. So we're not trying to water that down by any stretch of the imagination, but it cannot eclipse the rights of others if you're going to be part of the society. And that's where I think we're really running up against it right now. So, you know, to your question, Ryan, you know, should religion be in politics or whatever? Religious people are in politics, and they should be allowed to be religious people, period. What no one should be allowed to do is force everybody else to think and act like they do. And I don't care if you're right, left, or center. That's just not the way it works, right? You can fight for it. You can argue for it. That's what the whole structure and the system and the institutions are about. Make your case, you know, get mad, stomp your feet, you know, whatever. Don't lie. As we didn't get to misinformation and disinformation either, right? Because that's not sincere. I mean, just based on your own convictions, why would you do that, right? And don't coerce others, force others to do what you want them to do, unless it's what the law says, like not murdering other people or not lighting their homes on fire, stuff like that. Then yes, you can use the security implements of the state to stop them, right? But it's a challenge. Where does that identity, religious identity and religious ideology have its boundaries in a society that embraces freedom of worship?
Yeah, that's so good, James. And you sort of reminded me of it's so cheesy, this bumper sticker that a bunch of Christians put on their vehicles, but it's that NOTW, not of this world. And I think like it's no matter how, because Ryan, you kind of wanted to hear some of my thoughts on this, but no matter how you answer this question, it's going to sound like a sidestep or an oversight, or even like a complete like oversimplification of the problem, the issue, because it could be that a dude or a gal who's showing potential signs of a violent act taking place could simply be just looking for a friend, and he has succumbed to his own thoughts in isolation for you fill in the blank. And some of the data that was coming out now, most males in their 30 and 35 white male demographics, 40-45 are the ones committing a lot of violent acts. And there's all sorts of reasons why. They can draw it back to different points and really direct line of sight to where the issue started to where it transpired to a violent act. But ultimately, I think when in my personal experience, I try to ask, what are you afraid of in a sort of a few different ways, to people that I engage with who feel that we're acting correctly by destroying the other side. And a lot of the times it's just what they were taught. The way the brain works is you have 35 years worth of thoughts, and to unwire it in a moment is just, most of the time it's unrealistic. I don't hear a lot of that happening. But also leading them into this reality that Christians do believe this. Most of denomination under the Christian umbrella believe that they are not of this world. They believe they are citizens of heaven, and therefore we're operating under an entirely different like government. But all of us at times, easier to see the physical, if you would, act in a way that we're actually citizens of this world. And bear with me the language here, but the difference is ambassadors and citizens. And I invite people to be ambassadors. Look, ambassadors are still here and they participate in country. You can get a job. You can, in some countries, you can vote. But if you're a U.S. ambassador, for example, in a different country, you're not allowed to go to war for or against that country. And in this context, I would say your participation looks a lot more ambivalent. It looks more pensive. It looks more curious. And I want to bring it back to what you said, James. In any of this work, when someone is engaging first time, second time, 1,000th time, and lacks their humility, a curiosity and kindness leading with that, it's kind of a very obvious thing to sort of pick out. But it's by invitation, we jump into this stuff together. And I think lead with the example, because I think some of the issues, probably all of us run into, and just from small sphere to the bigger picture, is differing ideas showing up. And you had mentioned this, James, about just the groups getting together when it's too soon, and there hasn't been some of that initial work that needs a home, that pain that needs a home, and you're not going to put two different parties in the same environment. And I'm talking more outside of the political world, but like I'm reminded of like within the church, how much division is just based throughout the church, and most of the countries under the impression, mostly in the West, church in the West, the division just found in that space. And it's not exclusive to just the church. There's other groups now. I'm reminded of the J.K. Rowling drama with the trans community, and how they are technically operating in their own camp, but now there's a difference there, and there's a rift, there's a division. And how do you engage where, to your point, James, where you're not just sniffing someone out who disagrees with something about you and then shutting them out and destroying them at all costs. And I think there's got to be a different way. I think ultimately there's that business saying, it's the system you're in is designed to give you the results you're getting. And right now the country is continuously moving in a way, and not just the country, but like world at large stuff. And I think you said this early on, I think it's always kind of been the case. And we're always invited in to take up some of this work and do it together, and maybe even not repeat the mistakes of history because they're there. And also the last point I wanted to bring back up was over 84% of the world's population. I think it was the Pew Research team that did this, but they identified as spiritually affiliated in some capacity. And even if you boiled it down to like the election back in 2020, there was 71 million people who voted for the party that didn't get elected to administration. What do you do with the 71 million people? What do you do with the 84% of the global population? Are you literally going to go through each and every one of those people, find them, shut them out, and count? I don't know if cancel it can be said anywhere because of the connotation associated, but you want to destroy them. And it just it's not really working for the benefit of the flourishing of all human beings. And I think more of these conversations are starting to show up. I think the Eagles fans, there's so many stories I'm starting to hear, because I think people are starting to feel that little gentle invitation to just pick up and biopsy what you believe and how it's requiring you to engage with someone who might believe something differently. And ultimately hoping, the charismatic in me, the guy who wants to jump out of his seat right now, there's a little fire right here, is believing that, there is a change coming, that the war is over, if you would, and that the ground is desolate, that the thing that the war ran through is, but ultimately the farmers are being invited back to restore the land, to put the seed in the soil, to work that land, and to do it together, with no political affiliation whatsoever. Anything we say, what is that cult of personality song? Like, once a leader speaks, a leader dies. Like, that's the environment we're in. All of us are just sitting at the edge of our seat, afraid to say the wrong thing. And I just worry that, and what's actually transpiring, what's taking shape before us, before an election year, especially, how it's sort of priming, I guess, if you would. And so, like, I wonder on a very practical level, James, like, how do you get churches to maybe have some of these conversations? Is that anything ICRD is even attempting to do? Is that a goal or an objective? And like, do you facilitate those spaces? Is it through email? Like, because I think part of the piece you had mentioned that I wanted to bring back up too was just, you have to have the right messenger, and that they carry the context, and they have that credibility that's already established. And but let's, I guess, how do you get the church to maybe, if at all, and I'm making it about the church because it is just the avenue we're on topic of today. So
yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, we are engaging in that work domestically. One of the things that I think, at least in my experience, a lot of faith traditions struggle with a bit of a identity polarity, right? There are people in the tradition who think, I'm under the protection of the divine because I'm doing the right thing, and anyone who's out is excluded and maybe is a legitimate target for me to harm. And then there are adherents and believers who think the divine is natural. And I use the divine because it's a broad term, right? So God, Allah, wherever people find their sense of divinity, the divine is inclined towards human well-being, right? Particularly a creator God, a loving creator God, which is very much the Christian Godhead. Therefore, what does that look like if I'm manifesting the intentions of the divine, right? Am I acting out of the principles of love and healing? Even if I disagree with the person, I want to change them. Or am I acting out of the principles of anger and harm, hatred and harm? And for some groups of adherents, that hatred and harm is a legitimate manifestation of divine will. And for others, it's not, because when they describe what is divinity, what is the characteristic of their God, hatred and minimizing and harming humans is not, that doesn't fit their model of what Creator God would want for humanity, right? So maybe transformation is okay, but transformation with what? With what intention? Love or hatred? Healing or harm, right? And if you're doing that, people talk about, well, tough love and this, that, and the other thing. And I know there's a lot of stuff, the Bible is an interesting text. The Old Testament and New Testament kind of lean in different directions when it comes to this. And that's part of the spiritual journey of working with that sacred text. Because there's punishment and things. And I think people will lean towards that kind of tough love. You've got to hurt the other, or even worse, the idea of kind of cosmic war, that if you actually disagree with me, you're actually the devil, not just an agent of the devil, but the devil walking in the world. I know that's a part of the narrative now in some of these communities. And again, that's that intra-faith tension, right? But within that, there's plenty to incline people the other direction. So finding those voices who say, if we're trying to manifest God into God's creation, to use that language, the Christian language, right? Then are we actually manifesting God if we're doing it with a spirit of harm? And there are ways to engage in those conversations. Now, these days in certain spaces, it's a real challenge, and you better know your audience, right? And so our first task was to go, as I mentioned at the beginning, and listen. We did about 8 or 10 cities with a pilot project with some funds that we had actually meant to employ in Lebanon, but Lebanon was going through some really tough times, and my interfaith people said it wasn't really a good time to be doing stuff in Lebanon on that publicly. So we asked if we could shift the money here, because this was in the lead up to January 6th and everything, when it was the height of kind of COVID resistance was happening, and Black Lives Matter was marching, and the counter protests, and the rhetoric was building up. So we said, can we use this money to look around and see what could be the healing role of religious belief in this space, particularly in spaces where religion is inclining people towards wanting to do harm. So that's kind of why we ended up in a somewhat conservative space, because there is a crossover there of strong religious identity, strong political action, and the weapons of violence. Not that weapons of violence are exclusively there, but the religious overlay is. I honestly think that on a very atheistic or agnostic front, or anti-religious front on the left, if I can use those terms, left and right, and I think those are false binaries, but there's been a big manifestation of violence as well, where religion is part of it. It's just the rejection of religious identity, and that's got to come into this conversation as soon as we can get it into this conversation, because I don't believe in nor want to be perceived as pointing at conservative evangelicals and saying they're the problem. I'm actually not. I'm doing the opposite. I'm pointing at them and saying they can be part of the solution, but everyone's that isn't part of that group is saying they're the problem, and that's wrong. Let's go talk to them and find the folks who say, I'm conservative, I'm religious, I'm not sure I like all this other stuff in my society, but I know that God wants me to heal and not harm, and I'm going to make my community hear that, because that's my prophetic task as a pastor. So that's where we've located ourselves. And we're working with those pastors right now on processes of really understanding what the challenges are. And they're different in each community. There are places where, folks have left, houses of worship are emptying out because people are going to the radical pastor who's calling for violence. They're drawn to that right now. And so that those pastors are navigating, hey, how do I not become that person, but not lose my community at the same time, where I have influence? Because I won't have any influence. It's just me standing here on the Sundays, you know. And then there are others who are saying, you know, I get these folks once a week for an hour, and the news media has them the rest of the time, and the Twitter feed or whatever it's being called these days, X feed or social media feed, has them the rest of the time. How do I push back against that? Especially when these days, none of us know if what we're seeing, hearing, or reading is even true, right? Because of the power of misinformation. We're operating at the very least from two radically different realities. I mean, literally different realities. It's not that we have a different feeling about what should we do about a reality. We don't agree on the reality. That's a hard place to start a conversation, right? So we're working with those pastors now to really kind of unpack and identify, you know, where are the challenges they can address. And I was listening to one of these podcasts before that you all did with Cure Violence Leadership, and there was a moment in there where, you know, the conversation was, sometimes you have to just go at the thing you can affect now, even though you're excluding other things that are really important. And that's true. I mean, that's the nature of this work. But I want to go back. There's one other thing I want to say, and I should have said early on. Conflict itself is not bad, right? Conflict is value neutral, really. I lean on John Paul Lederach's work on this, the Mennonite Peacebuilder. You know, a conflict is what causes new relationships and new institutions to emerge that better serve the people that they're trying to serve, or the communities that are in relationship. United States history is littered with conflicts, some really grotesque, that I like to think in many cases has improved us. One of the things I'm very concerned about right now is this absolute unwillingness for anyone to admit that they're wrong about something, right? I always tell my team, when you go to do a job, when you have a program, you're going to go start on the assumption you're wrong. Not about everything, but about something, because then you come in with humility and you come in with adaptability. But there's this narrative now, either everything is totally right or everything is totally wrong. You can't criticize one group for anything at all or another group for anything at all without being some sort of identity traitor. And, you know, you're given this whole package of beliefs. If you're going to be this, you have to have all of this other stuff. And I agree with you. People are getting tired of that. I think that's actually a bright spot, is folks are saying, wait a minute, I'm tired of being told who I am just because I'm this, right? I would like to go back to being able to decide who I want to be on with some nuance. You know, maybe I agree with those guys on this point, even though I deeply, vociferously disagree with them on this other stuff. Maybe one of the things that my people want us to do, I'm not comfortable with. But where can I say that? Who can I say that to? So we're trying to find areas where we can start to build kind of landing spaces for folks who want to get back to negotiating their own identity a little bit, right? Not having to throw things out and not having to embrace things, but saying, wait, I'm not all that and I'm not all this. I'm actually okay with a little bit in between. And when that starts to happen, then they're going to find more people who meet them in that space who disagree with them on some of the other stuff. Now we're back to that multiplicity of identity that Amartya Sen writes about so powerfully in his book, Identity and Violence. And, you know, singularity of identity being such a driver of violence and conflict. Violent conflict, because again, conflict that gets transformed into something new and better is great, right? It's what you do with it. But if you can multiply those identities, again, you're an Eagles fan, you can't be all bad, right? Then you start to build pathways for empathy and understanding. And now we're back into the mix of social difference and nuance and people being able to allow each other to be different and find ways that they can do that while still holding their convictions. Because that's what this is. Again, our institutions are meant to protect and enshrine. I mean, if there is our way of life, which I hear a lot about, it's that. It's define who you want to be without hurting others, but then let them be who they want to be without hurting you. We got to get into the nitty gritty about what hurt means, right? Right now, we're pretty extreme on hurt. If you think a thing, if you say a thing, if you believe a thing, you're inherently hurting me. Well, that's taking it a little far. We got to dial that back a little.
Yeah, when you were sharing, I was reminded of a couple stories, of course, of Jesus. I know I'm pastor, guilty, but just his language around enemy love, and the teachings in regards to just enemy love. And if you boil and break down the language there in the Greek, it literally means to get your agenda, hold it, and set it aside while you engage with another person, regardless of their belief system, regardless of agreement or disagreement level. And that's where he actually goes on to define what is actual unity versus what we consider unity to actually be. And that if you and I see eye to eye on all these different pieces, then we're in unity. But back to conflict, Ryan and I, we work a little bit on conflict resilience trainings and a bunch of different ways to like reframe conflict because of the name it's getting and the way it's gotten like out of control. But even some of the training I do around like relationship and pastoral care around like marriages and stuff, conflict is but a portal to more intimacy, to more relationship, to more love, for actual like the door to open up to fostering a new environment with someone to, because what conflict is like two different people saying this is it, and really what we both want is like this to take place, by engaging some of those things that we think we believe versus what we want to believe, versus like the head is doing things but the heart needs to catch up, and there's a conflict and we don't know where to go from there. And so we do a little bit of work about that too. And I was just thinking back to your question, Ryan, on like politics, I guess, and the church and how they kind of blend and where they intersect. And I'm going to get dates wrong and all the things, but like 1715, the king's like, for those of you who believe in French Revolution, those of you believe this, stand on this side, those of you believe that, stand on this side. And there was like this two-way of living introduced to the world, if you would. And that's where kind of the church and state sort of got in the same bed, and it's really remained the same. And it's like the person who is from the Crusades to now, the same idea is the same. The same idea then is still the same today, in that we are going to use the name of religion or Christ or the teachings of the Old Testament for the sake of removal of life, for the sake of violence, or whatever the case may be. And there's plenty of scripture that will give way and justify any of those means. To be honest, there's plenty of scripture that would do that. But that's when engaging with the sacred text literally, recognizing that we lost a lot of our ability and capacity to actually translate some of these genres from 3,000 years ago. And just hearing that, like there's one flood narrative in the book of Genesis, and there's 20,000 others that we know of outside of the book of Genesis. You tell someone who's held scripture as an authority in their life, or as just something they engage with for the sake of justifying their behavior, whichever. And we all have the susceptibility and do those things to, once we believe something, we set out to find the evidence to support those claims. And it's kind of just a reality that a lot of people succumb to. But how politics blends there with the church, I think, Ryan, is tricky, because I think it's if I'm honest, my experience growing up in the church, it was taught as one in the same. And you voted conservative, you voted for the right, and it was because of the abortion topic, right? And it was because of sexuality issues and gender, and those were the defining characters. And that was basically the rule to the exception, for sure, in the West, which is still led to a lot of churches today. But I once again, the charismatic guy shows up every now and then, but it's like, I think churches are starting to engage these conversations and allowing for more nuance. I mean, maybe that's just because I live in Portland, but a lot of churches are picking these up and saying, man, maybe maybe we just did a lousy job around race and ethnicity and politics and sexuality and gender for the last 20 years. And we are paying the price now. And now we have to decide, are we just going to do that again? And in 20 years, our kids are going to inherit another mess. And so that's church specifically. So,
well, you bring up the concept of love, and honestly, going back to Ryan's question, church is not state, state is not church, but if you had more church people in the state who were driven by a love doctrine, I would be thrilled, right? Because what does it mean to love another, to love your enemy, right? Like, picture in your mind right now, your political enemy and how mad you are at whoever that person might be. What does it mean to love that person? It's not this abstraction of like, yes, Jesus tells me I have to love, therefore love is there, but I want him burned at the stake, thrown in prison, drawn and quartered, effigies. Love actually means you want the best for the other person. You want them whole and healed. And you can look at someone and say, what they're doing hurts them and others. But I'm not going to make them better by beating them, right? I need to make them better by finding what is in them that's human, that has need, that hurts, and helping to heal it. And part of doing that is I got to be humble in the face of that, because maybe I need to change at the same time, right? And so these concepts of humility, and grace, and love and compassion are so deeply woven into the Christian tradition that if that were the manifestation of the Christian faith that I was seeing, I would be saying, bring it on, right? Or whatever faith or no faith. If people are actually being driven by, I want to make that person feel cared for because they're obviously in pain. Wow. Imagine the difference. At least my email inbox would look terrifically different if I were getting political messages from folks saying, send me $5 so I can increase the love in our institutions. I'd be like, click instead of unsubscribe, right? And you talked about ideology. Honestly, one of the things that I draw from, because I grew up Roman Catholic, so and I have a master's in divinity, full disclosure, and looked a lot at these sort of pro-social principles and faith traditions, including Christianity, and preached and other things. But one of the things I come back to a lot, and I lose a lot of pastors when I talk to them about this, because I know it's controversial, and sometimes I feel like it makes people want to slap me around. But when I think about the stories of the old stories of theology in the Bible, specifically Lucifer, right? And I think, well, here's the angel of light, right? The right hand of the old man, if you want to put it that way. And what was Lucifer? And I'm really riffing. You asked me to riff, and so I'm freewheeling with this theology right now, right? But what was Lucifer didn't say one day, I'm going to put on a red suit and a tail and some horns and go stab people with a pitchfork like we see at, Halloween. Lucifer thought he got it. Lucifer was so close to the truth for so long that he said, I don't need the old man anymore. I'm going to live in a godless space because I got the truth. Capital T, truth. And a godless space, if you go back to the principle of love, is a space of pain, a space of anger, a space of ill health, deterioration, right? It's not healing and growth and wholeness and kindness and compassion and happiness. It's the opposite. And I don't know how many religious folks I know, and I'm sure I'm guilty of it myself in many ways, think, oh, I got the capital T truth. Where's the room for the divine? Where is your prophetic transformation? If you think you know it all, ain't that what Lucifer did? And now, sadly, without any openness for the eruption of the divine, as the Jesuit liberationists would call it, John Sobrino and others, there's no way for you to be influenced into the better self beyond human capacity, right? Because I think all faith doctrines agree humans are imperfect. That's something that we can all agree on, right? Because we are not the divine. So where's the room for the divine if you've cut it out? Where's the room for your growth? Where's the room for your improvement, which I think is the nature of divinity? Make things more whole, make things more healed. So if you've got the capital T truth in there, and you don't need to hear from the old man or woman or counsel or however you see your divinity, then you're committing, I think, one of the great blunders of theologically aware people. Oftentimes it's the people who have the best training and a lot of spiritual practice who fall victim to that. And I used to have this, again, speaking with pastors about working with indigenous, I remember in Colombia telling a group of pastors, well, you all don't want to work with these guys, but they're trying to build peace just like you are. And they're like, yeah, well, first of all, we've looked at their faith, it's Satanism. To which, of course, I replied, they don't believe in Satan. So you're kind of off on the wrong track. They're not Satanists because that's not part of their cosmology. But I understand you think you have the right way to God. I get that. That's cool. And I'm cool with that. Through Jesus, through the Bible, through your faith, gets you to God. But now you're saying God only has one route back to humans. The same way you went up, he can come down. And you're saying God can't be functioning in these other folks. That's pretty theologically arrogant, right? We know how to get to you, but we're going to tell you what you can and can't do as God in the world. And, I'd lose half of these guys, and then the other half I knew I could work with, right? Because they come back and they'd be like, let's do this thing, right? Because maybe there is God there, right? And again, my Quakerism helps me a lot because we fundamentally believe that the light of the divine is in everything and everyone, right? So there's not only a way to engage it, there's a way to learn from it. But that requires humility and openness and to be in the process where that small, soft voice, you're available to it, right? But so many of us are screaming and yelling and stomping our feet so loud. I have a quote on my wall here that says, the voice of God is like dew, it never settles in a storm. And that's where I think we're at right now. The most religiously defiant seem to have very little room for the voice of the divine in their faith. And I think that's damaging to them and the rest of us, and I'm sure I do it, like I said, and my first obligation is to work on me, get the stick out of my own eye, right? So I'm not trying to tell anybody they should be doing anything, but I think that's a really important moment we're in right now that is really making religion not as powerful and beautiful as it could be for us as a society.
Yeah. And I was once again reminded, and Ryan, you're going to probably have to shut us up and cut us off, man, because at some point, but Jesus, well, he was alive. Most scholars would say that he was Pharisee, right? He was a Pharisee. Literally, he was doing what a Pharisee does for a day job. But yet he was after what? The religious elites, and he accused them of running their mouths and not doing what they taught, right? Whitewashed sepulchres, but on the inside full of dead man's bones. And you get at that same idea in that it's less about what you believe, and more about how you're wielding those things, like being right at the top of your voice, and what does it all mean if not for wielding behaviors that are loving? Like, regardless, if it's a debate, great, let's define and refine our ideas and engage for the sake of relationship building versus ripping each other down. And there's got to be a better way.
Yeah, and many of us were taught in our faith upbringing that to question and doubt is weakness. And I think that's exactly wrong. I think to question and doubt is supplication. It's asking, it's inviting
right.
What is more than I am to guide me. I mean, people pray all the time in all these different traditions. How do you pray if you don't have weakness, right? You're asking for something. Well, then pray around your understanding as well. let me be an instrument of your peace. That's one of the things we used to say in my Catholic upbringing, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know how many people knew what they were saying when they were saying it, but that means putting a lot of things aside. It means being really uncertain that you're doing it right, because you're always going to be stumbling when you're trying to build peace, right? And of course, now I'm coming back to my vocation, but so if you're not willing to be helped along, particularly by your sense of the divine, right? And most people's idea of the divine is much more akin to perfection than most humans are. Then you're gonna do bad work at best, and you're gonna do harm at worst. And so it's, again, it might render me a heretic in some people's eyes, but I think doubt and humility need to lead, and love follows hard along, and then we can start getting some stuff done. It doesn't mean you can't believe what you believe. It doesn't mean you can't be for or against something. It doesn't mean you can't think someone's doing bad things and want to isolate them or separate them from society or whatever. But enter with a spirit of healing them and yourself, and the openness to know where you need that. And then we'll get some stuff done together,
Right.
Well, I think we wandered down some beautiful alleyways here, and I'm sure we could go on for a long time, Gabe. Particularly
Totally could.
Logical front, you and I could probably pound on the book a little bit, or whatever books we want to pound on. I'm a mystic in many ways, right? It's like there's something there, and I want to know more of it, right? Whatever it might be. And so
I think that posture of openness versus closed off, I think that's the clear tell of whether your life to satisfaction, fulfillment, and purpose behind it is obviously love or not. You are receptive to receive and to give love. And if you find yourself in a way that's this closed, head in the sand, then chances are there's some biopsy at best, reassessment at better, and just like in like this non-dramatic fashion, and that we can pick this up together, and we get it. We understand there's a lot to it. But what is it like? There's peacekeeping and then there's peacemaking, and they're two entirely different behaviors. And I think, but we could very easily continue this conversation, but for now, thank you.
Thank you. And Ryan, I'm sorry, I think we've kind of trampled over your plans for the for the conversation. I hope this isn't too much to wade through.
Not at all. This is exactly how I wanted it to go, and it was really a joy to see both you guys, riffing, and I feel like we're getting some energy to speak for another 3-4 hours. So I know it's getting late for you too, James, living on the East Coast, but thank you so much to both of you. It was a real pleasure, and I'm really happy to infuse this kind of theological spirit into some of the work we're doing. So thanks to both of you guys.
Hey, awesome. Man, thank you guys very much. Both of you. Thanks, Ryan.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. If you want to stay up to date with the CURE-PDX project, go to cure-pdx.org. Again, that's CURE-PDX.org. And if you want to talk more about trainings, dialogues, events, or anything related to the CURE-PDX project, email us at curepdx@cvg.org. Again, that's curepdx@cvg.org. We look forward to hearing from you.